All right, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to go ahead and start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing chemical control for wild pig population. Uh, I know that a lot of y'all are joining in the middle of your day, so we're going to try and keep it strictly to about an hour. And we plan to leave a little bit of time towards the end for questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to shoot them towards the Q&A feature in Zoom. All right, and our host today is going to be John Kinsey. John Kinsey is our Director of Business and Conservation Initiatives. He has studied various aspects of wild pig ecology and management for over a decade in roles such as the lead research biologist at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Feral Swine Research Facility and a PhD candidate at the University of Texas, San Antonio. John is a certified wildlife biologist, past president of the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society, and is currently serving as the chair-elect of the National Wild Pig Task Force. All right, John, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. The format for today's webinar is going to look a little different than what we typically do. It's going to be a lot less PowerPoint driven and more conversational between our guest and myself here. So hopefully it'll be a little different than what you're used to, maybe a little refreshing. So we're going to get rolling, and I'll introduce you to our guest today is Dr. John Tomeček. He's an associate professor in the Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M University. His work focuses on management of wildlife damage and diseases, wild pigs, and carnivorous wildlife. He leads the National Wild Pig Task Force and is the chairman of the National Wildlife Services Advisory Committee, helping set policy and management priorities for species causing damage to agriculture nationwide. John, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here, John. Also, I appreciate the format kind of breaking from PowerPoint because it can get overwhelming, I think, for everybody. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to kick it off. We're just going to kind of go a basic review of some of the most commonly used population control techniques out there from a global perspective.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting way of looking at it too, because obviously techniques differ in terms of what gets used by countries depending on what they're comfortable with regulatorily. But in a lot of ways, as you and I know, it comes down to what works in the environment that you're working in, and then what works for your kind of personal operational capacities, right? Whether that's in an agricultural context, or what works for your farm or ranch, or if you're a municipality or state government, provincial government, whatever you happen to be. So, I think classically and most commonly we see shooting methods, whether that's ground-based shooting or whether that's aerial shooting. We see ground-based methods in trapping, whether that's box-style traps, corral-style traps, net-style traps, whatever folks happen to envision. And then we see a number of different tools in the toolkit that are kind of coming online, chemical being one of them, contraceptives are another one that's down the road a little ways, but definitely of interest. And so it's usually those kind of combinations. But I like to break it out and talk about, when we do ground-based shooting, that takes a lot of forms. I think most folks think about, well, we've got, at least in our part of the country, right? There's a hunter in a deer blind or in a stand or out somewhere, and they're hunting and they see a pig and they shoot it. That controls pigs. It removes a pig. But I think one thing that we lose sight of is the art is in the strategic application. So it's not just that. It's a farmer's growing a corn crop, and we know through research there's two very critical times for that crop that it's most subject to pig damage. And so sometimes just getting shooters out at night when pigs show up to shoot a few pigs and run them off so that crop can get through a critical phase, that's what works for that farmer in their operation with their time and labor and economically. That's a strategic application of shooting, just like somebody using night vision or thermal technologies to say, look, pigs are active at night, and it's an interesting kind of sidebar of pig behavior. they don't think you can see them at night because they've learned that we're a diurnal species. So being able to get out there at night and get pigs that maybe you can in other ways, I think it's that. Just like with trapping, as you know and I know, there's strategic applications to trapping, right? We're looking for pig activity, pig damage. Where are we putting that trap? How are we baiting it to convince them to come in? And it's all of the combinations of those tools. But when you get multiple tools on the landscape, now we're really starting to move, because now we're saying, okay, I'm going to use an integrated pest management approach and use the tools where I can get them, how I can get them, not only what works for my operation, but now I'm gonna set a trap over here. I'm gonna bait those pigs into that trap. I'm gonna get them so comfortable that they're sleeping in the trap, they're nursing piglets in the trap. They love that trap because it's got cheap, easy food. And then I'm gonna shoot them elsewhere so that they think those areas are bad and scary and my traps are safe and good. So now I've got them moving on two fronts. And I think that's what we look at with approaches to pig management. There's always not just a new tool coming out. Sometimes it's a new modification. Like we went from manually triggered traps and all the different trigger mechanisms you can have there. And you and I both know there's a million different ways to envision a pig setting a trap off. And then we moved into the world of remotely triggered pig traps. I was about to say piggered pig traps. So we moved into a different era where we used a new technology, right? That all came around when cell phones really got to be better coverage, better strength. Cool. So technology changes and we take advantage of that. And that's, across wildlife management. But I think it's interesting to start taking a step back and saying, okay, not only have I got this out there, but how can I use that tool differently to keep those pigs moving when they realize what one approach is? How do I give them something new that they haven't seen before that they perhaps don't fall prey to? And so I think that's, for our purposes today, I think it's interesting because most methods fall under some kind of shooting or they fall under some kind of trapping. And like I say, not everything works everywhere. The classic example I give all the time is aerial shooting in urban environments. That's not going to happen, right? We're not going to fly a helicopter in a big city and shoot in any world I can imagine. It's a very effective tool, but there's other things that just prohibit its use there.
Absolutely. And so I think what I'm hearing is under the right prescription, all of those methods that you just talked about are impactful, they're helpful in reducing pig populations. So if that's the case, why in your mind is it important that we continue to research and investigate new tools and technologies such as chemical controls?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I had this one once upon a time when it was about traps even, and it was in the question of different kinds of remote triggers for traps. And, you could do it cell phone enabled and you can do it satellite enabled, right? That's possible. Just most people don't. You and I know that technology exists. We use it on like large carnivore traps. We have cell phone enabled monitoring devices that are satellite driven. And why? Why do we even bother, right? Why don't we do the same thing that we were doing 150, 200 years ago? I always think that's an interesting question because the old methods still work. And I'm a person that believes in keeping the old ways around because one, they're useful to know, but two, they have a place and a time. I think what I see from a pig management standpoint is not everybody's going to get out there and shoot in any context, right? Not everybody's going to go run aerial. Not everybody's going to go hunt. Not everybody's going to go night shoot. And some folks just say, look, we're not comfortable with that. That's not what we do. Okay, or it doesn't work in our environment. So, okay, let's trap. Well, but not everybody's going to trap either for a variety of reasons. And for some folks, that's time and effort. For some folks, that's, look, I'm getting to that point in my life where physically it's difficult. And trapping pigs is a labor-intensive thing that we do. So yeah, it's getting a little difficult. Not something I can really keep up with anymore. I think when we work on new technologies, whether they are improvements on existing methods, right, to make it less labor intensive, just like cell phone game cameras help us monitor traps, so we don't have to run out there every day if it still has bait. I think these new technological approaches either help us keep a method on the landscape or they help open up land to management that didn't have it, or is about to not have it because someone says the existing tools just don't work for me where I am with other things I've got going on. And I would give the example of, we're not there yet with contraceptives, and I'm sure in this hour we'll talk about that some. One thing that I hear globally from colleagues and friends, especially that work in urban environments, is almost every other method is really hard to do in an urban environment. Trapping works to an extent, but in some areas that just doesn't, how to say, it's not palatable to the citizens. So the citizens say, we don't want that. Well, in a society where citizens get to choose how things are managed, they can say no. So folks say, we're waiting on a contraceptive because that's really what our people want. And boy, that would open up management in an area where we don't have it. And I think that's really the heart of why we come up with new approaches. It's not only putting more tools in the toolkit, because that's always good, right? I like a big toolbox. I like more specialty tools, but it's also about keeping management on the landscape or getting more of it, because all of us that work in pig management and pig ecology, as you know, the landscape level impact, the landscape level management is what we're all striving for, to try to start pushing those pig populations back down. And that's not unique to here in the US. It's not unique to North America. It's a European context with wild boar, in Australia with their wild pig problems, right? It's always about how can I get more land under management, and that means I have to bring a tool to that land manager or owner that fits in with what they can and are willing to do.
All right. So I think the majority of our conversation here, as you alluded to, with chemical control techniques, is probably going to be focused around toxicants.
Yep.
So let's start with maybe where toxicants are currently being used around the world, and briefly discuss what active ingredients there are being used globally.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And for everybody that's tuning in, when we talk about chemical control, toxicants are one side of that equation. Reproductive control, reproductive inhibitors are another side of that equation, right? And so in the world of toxicants, really what we see for the most part right now is sodium nitrites being used down in Australia. And we've got warfarin-based toxicant here in the United States that has an EPA registration. And as far as my knowledge goes, Texas is still the only state with a state registration. And I always give that caveat, guys, because I'm not a regulator. I'm not an expert on who's got it labeled when and where. It's possible somebody did something yesterday I haven't caught yet. But that's what we're seeing. So, we've got sodium nitrite in Australia, and that mode of action is a chemical that it's going to take that hemoglobin and strip the oxygen off those red blood cells. So hemoglobin to methemoglobin, if you're interested in that. And essentially, you've got an oxygen deprivation. And then with the warfarin-based toxicant, warfarin is an anticoagulant. It's been used as a rodenticide, at least in North America, since the 1940s. And that anticoagulant is also used in human medical therapeutic approaches, right? So blood thinners, if you're on a Coumadin or something like that, those are next generation chemicals that if you've got cardiovascular problems, keep that going. And so in the context of using those active ingredients, that warfarin is going to act as a blood thinner. So you're going to have internal hemorrhaging, usually a brain bleed, something along those lines. And that's usually the mode of action to get death on those animals. And again, that's been used for a very long time. That's being used in rodents, and it's widely available. I think one thing that's interesting, and I know we'll get into this more, warfarin in its classic formulation, right? Not of the next generation anticoagulants. Classic warfarin is one of those that actually doesn't have a long residence time in the body. It's metabolized really, really quickly, which I think is interesting for wildlifers, because we mostly think about anticoagulants in the context of newer generation items that stay in the body longer.
Sure. Okay. And for time purposes here, we're probably just going to stick to sodium nitrite and warfarin-based toxicants. I know there's sodium fluoroacetate.
Yeah, true.
But I think for the interest of time, we'll stick to sodium nitrite. and warfarin moving forward. You touched a little bit on sodium nitrite. If you don't mind, I'll just expand a little bit.
Please do. You're far more expert in it than I am.
I don't like that E word, but sure.
Let's say you've been around it more than I have. How about that?
That's fair. That's
Yeah.
fair. So you touched on kind of the mode of sodium nitrite as a toxicant. It is that it induces methemoglobinemia, which does convert methemoglobin or oxyhemoglobin to methemoglobin, which just simply reduces the red blood cells' ability to transport oxygen to the tissues, results in hypoxia. That's an obvious oversimplification, but I have no desire to get into a discussion on blood chemistry here today. So, the interesting thing about sodium nitrite is, it's an acute toxicant. It doesn't take much of it from a wild pig perspective to be effective. Pigs just don't produce much methemoglobin, which is the body's enzyme that naturally produced specifically to convert that methemoglobin back into oxyhemoglobin. So the methemoglobin reductase just isn't there to capacity to quickly convert back to oxyhemoglobin A, and then they just don't produce it rapidly either. So it makes them a little more susceptible to sodium nitrite poisoning than some other species. However, it is absolutely not a species-specific toxicant. I don't think any of these toxicants are, and I have my fingers crossed that someday we figure out how to come up with one. But to date, we've not. And so we've got to look at other means and methods to make those toxicants species specific. And I think pretty much what we've all landed on here is a species specific feeder, a device that will only allow wild pigs to access that bait and be primary consumers of that bait. And there's a handful of them out there that have all been they've all been researched and they've been published in peer-reviewed literature. So I'm not going to go into the details of them, but the vast majority of those out there, the mechanism that makes those species specific is simply the rooting activity of pigs. And they get their snout under a bar or the lid or whatever that particular feeder looks like, and they're able to raise that. And just most other animals are not going to exhibit that behavior from a feeding context. I think the only non-target species in the feeder that I was associated with developing that was able to access was a raccoon. And, they're just incredibly dexterous. And we ended up with a weighted lid, which is another common method used for these different bait stations or feeders, is to weight that lid to limit access to other non-target species. I say that with one caveat. To my knowledge, we have not been able to successfully deliver feed to pigs specifically, in bear habitat. If there are bear in the vicinity, talk about a large dexterous animal. Those are, and there's research going on again that I may not be privy to. So somebody may have cracked that nut that I don't quite know about yet.
You're right though, John. I mean, that's always been the big issue, and in anything we've done, that's kind of the assumption, and that caveat to everything else is, at least in our part of the world, right? American black bears just don't use it when there are bears around. And I think the thing I remind everybody, if you're not from our part of the world, right? Common names and common terms for wildlife are always fun. We use the same male and female words for bears that we do for raccoons. And if you look at the skull morphology of bears and raccoons, they look the same. And as a student of mine once said, Doc, a bear is just a 300-pound raccoon. And there's actually some truth to that in terms of ecology, foraging habits, whatnot, especially when it comes to anthropogenic foods. And I think in this case, right, it's also that they're opportunistic omnivores, and they're going to take advantage of that. And we know they've got the dexterity to open pretty much anything we can design. If we can keep a bear out, well, we keep pigs out too. And that's the problem. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, We already mentioned that sodium nitrite is being used successfully in Australia. It's
Mhm.
registered in New Zealand. I'm not sure how much they actually use it in New Zealand, but it is registered there as a pig toxicant. And I'm aware of some cursory investigations in some places in Asia Pacific, the,
Mhm.
where they're just kind of starting to scratch the surface to see if it may be a tool available to them there. Here in the States specifically, sodium nitrite is not yet registered by the EPA as a toxicant for pigs. There's a couple different products that are still being investigated.
Mhm.
Both of them use sodium nitrite as the active ingredient. None of those have yet made it through the entire EPA registry process. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not exactly sure where each of those stand. But I would say that we're still quite a ways away from actually having a registered sodium nitrite toxicant in the States.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you and I talk about a lot when it comes to these, and obviously EPA is concerned about and others are concerned about, is also non-target impacts.
Absolutely.
And with sodium nitrite, that was one of our issues here in the States was non-target impacts on birds, as you know as well as anybody. And I think this is an interesting segue into an acute toxicant versus a chronic toxicant, right? So the warfarin-based product is a chronic toxicant. You have to deliver a consistent dose for, I always just generalize it and say 5 or 6 days. There's some variability in there, but let's say 5 or 6 days, you have to deliver a fairly small but chronic dose. And then at that point, enough of a load has been built up in the body that those animals will expire sometime after that. It's not very long. But the interesting thing about that is that fact that it's not an acute toxicant, although in some cases folks may say, hey, I don't want that. I want something that's one and done. It also gives us the ability to fix non-target exposure issues, right? Because stuff is not going to get a dose and expire right away. You still don't want a non-target exposure, but it's a little bit of flexibility to fix an oops. But I think in either case, one of the struggles that we've gotten into is trying to minimize non-target exposure to begin with. And when we talk about these feeders and baits, feeders are a mechanical device. No mechanical device is perfect. They all need maintenance. They all need you to be diligent. I give everybody the analogy, even though it's a lot more complicated, of you don't go buy a new vehicle, never change the oil, never maintain anything, and expect it to run forever. Of course, that doesn't happen. And if you ignore it long enough, it will break down unexpectedly, which is bad for you. So there's routine maintenance, there's preventative maintenance. And I think with any of these feeders, that's something that we all have to acknowledge, and everything's got a service life. But it's that non-target exposure is one of those things that I know has been a struggle for sodium nitrite, but even for the warfarin product, it's just minimizing that and what's going on mechanically out there in the field that might allow for that or make that bait more or less palatable to other animals, right?
Sure. That's a great segue into into warfarin, and some of the research that you've been involved with and some of your experience
Yep.
with that ingredient. Would you be able to give us a little bit of background on some of those
Yeah, no,
topics?
glad to do it. So just to give everybody a little bit of background, of course, EPA registered the product in 2017 at a federal level here in the United States. And so for those of you that are tuning in from outside the US, our Environmental Protection Agency gets to regulate the registration of pesticides, and in this case, vertebrate pesticides. And so once they have a registration, then states are allowed to issue their own registrations, which can be as liberal as the federal registration or more restrictive, but they can't be, you know, outside of the bounds of what the feds allow. So 2017, we had an EPA registration because the product had been around so long, there had been research done. It was just adding a new species to an existing chemical registration. And I want to make that clear for folks with sodium nitrite, that's a brand new registration. That's a big, long process. So in this case, that happened. Texas had intended to register the product and a couple other states too. And then there was a little bit of political consternation, but also some unanswered questions that folks had. And so we went a couple of years after that, or a few years. And in 2021, our state government, our legislature here in Texas, requested that A&M conduct a series of field efficacy trials to get the product out on privately owned lands, farms and ranches, being applied by private applicators. So normal folks that would be applying this product if it were out to the public, and asking us to monitor use and see what the efficacy looked like under what conditions. Basically to say, can it actually work? Does it work everywhere all the time? Or if not, where and when? And tell us anything you can see on if this will actually make a difference in the war on pigs, as we say. And I want to say, when it's the question of like, will it work everywhere all the time? Obviously, we're all big on talking about how great Texas is, right? And it's a big state, but it's also ecologically diverse. And this is something important to remember. If you've never been here, or if your idea of Texas is just movies, awesome. But Texas is more than tumbleweeds and saguaro cacti, which don't actually grow here. That's Arizona, but that's okay. Texas is really ecologically diverse. In eastern Texas, you've got swamps and bogs and pine forest. And in the central part of the state, you've got prairies and plains. South Texas, you've got subtropical thorn scrub environment. You've got coastal beaches. You've got mountains and sky islands in far west Texas. You've got everything in between, right? So a lot of environmental diversity, a lot of weather diversity. And one of the things that came up, and it was a fair point, the question was, because the antidote to warfarin is vitamin K1, and we know this from a veterinary medicine context, right? If your dog eats a rat poison that is warfarin, you take him to the vet, they administer K1 to reverse that. K1 is present in green growing plants. So springtime, early summer, or if you're in a different part of the world, whatever time of year that happens to be for you, when plants are growing newly for the year, there's a lot of vitamin K1 present. And so the question was, well, these pigs eat a lot of vegetation. If we feed them this stuff, are they just going to go walk away and eat something green and new in the spring and summer? And will it even work? Fair question. Nobody knew that. So we did this experiment across the state in every season of the year in every ecological region that we have in Texas. And we also tried to really get it around diverse agriculture, but also diverse non-target species to see if we had any issues keeping non-targets out or any interest there. So for 2 years, we had private applicators applying this product according to best practices that we put together. And those best practices existed inside of the instructions on the registration, right? It's just, let me make everything super duper clear for you and give you a play-by-play on how we want this thing used. And then we watched. And the long story made short is that the product worked. It worked everywhere ecologically. It worked all throughout the year. But the real caveat to whether or not it worked was if folks were really diligent in their application. Nobody broke the law, but some folks overestimated or underestimated the amount of time they would have to use this product and get it out in the field. But in places where folks used it, we saw 75%, 90% reduction in the number of pigs in areas that, if you're not familiar with Texas, we have so many pigs that in some contexts, eradication's really, I'm not saying it's impossible, it's very difficult, right? As soon as you kill them, more show up. These are places that are like that, right? So it doesn't matter how many we remove, but looking at pig activity on the property, we're down 75 or 90% from the beginning of a year to the end of a year. That's a big deal for that agricultural producer. In other areas, in more arid, more montane environments, folks went valley to valley and killed the pig sounders in each valley because their local knowledge, and I can't stress this enough, local managers know activity on their properties. Local managers said, we typically have a sounder per valley because the resources are all structured around water. Okay. So they went valley to valley and they killed out most of the sounders on their property. And they said, we haven't had anything fill back in yet. We're sure they will one day, but it bought us time, right? So it could work. Where it doesn't work is when folks don't put out this bait consistently, because you like trapping. It's the same as trapping. You got to train them to the bait, train them that it's there so that they will eat that bait consistently every night. So again, just like if you're in a trapping context, you need that consistent traffic so that when you're ready to set to catch, whether it's a manual trap or a remote triggered trap, I don't really care, they'll be there. Same as in this context. You need them to eat that bait, because if they don't, let's say you put out bait and they eat night one, good. And then you forget for 4 or 5 days and it's been empty and you go fill that feeder back up again. They've had enough time for that warfarin to metabolize. It's left their body, and the effects of that warfarin have now been reversed by their body. So now you're essentially starting over. The other place it doesn't work, and this is the same as trapping, is I have pigs trained to a site. They're coming and they're eating consistently. We had some cases where the pigs were so comfortable with the feeder device that when you came to check on it to fill it up, they were sleeping around it, propped up against it. We had one sow propped against a feeder nursing piglets. Cool. And then you pull up and they get up and they move, right? They don't even run anymore. They just kind of shuffle out of the way into the brush and they wait. And then you fill it up. And then as you're driving away, they shuffle back out. We had a place where a ranch hand just couldn't take it anymore. And I have the camera footage somewhere, right? In the background, you can see like the pigs are there and they're milling around, and the truck comes down the road and it stops, and you can see the window go down and you can see the rifle barrel come out. And it's like, oh, I can empathize. I really can, right? It hurts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. But it's like he shoots, he kills a sow, the rest run off, and they don't come back again, right? So it's like, okay, well, they got a sublethal dose. They're going to recover. And I think that's the trick there is you have to be diligent and you have to really be in it for the process. Just like trapping, using a toxicant's a process. And one thing that I point out when we have this talk is if you look on the best practices from the manufacturer of any toxicant, they're going to walk you through the process, and the processes all look pretty darn similar, and they look really similar to best practices for a corral style trap. It's training animals in, getting them to consistently feed, getting them patterned. And it's that dedication to training those pigs and not dissuading them off that site. So I digress, but with the warfarin product, it's we saw it work. We saw a lot of success with it when people were willing to spend the time. The thing that was interesting for me, and we can delve into this more, we really didn't have non-target issues. So we never presented the product to non-targets to see if they would eat it or not. But we had a placebo version of it. And while we were getting pigs accustomed to the feeders, we would mix corn with the placebo. The product is a paraffin-based block. It's got a blue dye in it, just so if you had a pig that had been killed from it, you can see this blue dye in adipose tissue and fat tissue. And that bait has got a variety of attractants in it. This was what was interesting for me. Because of the variety of attractants in it, I have a sneaking suspicion that most animals weren't interested. They give it a sniff, they don't care for it. The only thing we really saw that was interested were raccoons. So they were interested in the product, but even things like javelina, which we were concerned about here in Texas,
Sure.
javelina didn't seem interested. And even with their morphology being one that I would expect to be able to activate that feeder, they didn't show any interest in learning to activate the feeder, even when they saw pigs using it. And we had big pigs use it. We also had little pigs figure it out. So, after mom has lifted that door and they see it, we've got a few photos of three piglets standing shoulder to shoulder, lifting the door together. And that to me is just success in terms of getting those animals trained, right? You've got them, you've trained them to use a device, but that process takes time. It's not one that they just walk up to a feeder and they know how to use it, no matter what toxicants you end up with.
Sure. And just kind of echo a little bit of the regionally specific and to go back to the theme of all of these tools can be useful when administered responsibly under the right prescription. There was one field site in the EPA testing for that sodium nitrite project that did have some non-target issues. But it was also tested at other field sites and at different times of the year and with minimal to no non-target issues. So it is just as important as any other tool to make sure that we're using local knowledge, our expertise of the landscape and the wildlife that are on that landscape, and make sure that we're responsibly administering whatever population control method that we are administering, right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree completely. And I think that's the thing is any of these tools that we use they can be used poorly. I hesitate to say somebody would say, oh, they can be used for good or evil. They can be used poorly. Sometimes poorly means they don't work. Sometimes poorly means they have unintended consequences that aren't desired, right? The thing I remind people when you say, well, I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, money talks. Everything costs money. No method, no matter what we're talking about, shooting, trapping, toxicants, nothing's free, and money is money. So if you're starting a process, whether that's baiting a trap or whether that's using a toxicant, you want to stretch that dollar as far as you can. And I think in this context, it's if you're diligent in your work, you will use less product, you will be more efficient. And that really, for me, is the biggest attractant in terms of following instructions to the letter and really making the time for the method. If I want to use it, I'm going to spend money on it, and I want to get as much out of it as I can. And I think that's true for anything.
So what are we doing, we in a general sense, to ensure that any toxicant that we have available to us is being used safely in a responsible manner?
Yeah, good question. So I think it's super important for everybody to read the product registration, right? The registrations and the labels therein are so detailed in their descriptions of how to use the product, how to be safe with the product, do's and don'ts. To the extent of where we didn't have any issues or concerns about livestock getting into the feeder or getting into the product, and we used it around sheep and goats and cattle and whatnot. But the registration is also very clear. Remove livestock from the area that it's being used. Okay, fair enough, right? As a person that's done a lot of pig trapping in my life, I'm not going to be sad if I don't have cows in a pasture with a trap because cows love messing up everything. I love my cattle. I grew up in cattle, but for a wildlifer, I won't be sad if I keep the cattle out of there for a little while. And I think that's the thing is every prohibition prescription that is in that registration, in that label, is there for a reason. Folks need to read that thing diligently. In the case of the warfarin product, the manufacturer also has their own stewardship training. If you're in Texas and you go to an event hosted by the Extension Service, we've created resources for county staff to train folks on kind of our best practices based on all of our trials and how can I be safe and careful, but also do this well. And I think that's the thing. There's a ton of resources out there. The folks that make products that control pigs want you to be successful with them. And the toxicant is no exception to that, right? Whether it's this one or if it was sodium nitrite or whatever it was, whoever's making this stuff wants you to be successful because that's part of the law, but also they want you to be happy with their product. And all of these tools, like we started off talking about, all of these tools can be effective when used in the right place and in the right way. So I think for us, trying to stay safe from a human context, it's talking about what to do and not to do around those chemicals. And in an animal context, it's how do we keep non-targets out of it? Because we're not mad at this stuff. We don't want anything to get into it, right? And those were some of the questions that we asked because let's say, Javelina's also learned how to open the feeder and use it. That would have been a source of concern where our regulatory agencies for pesticides and wildlife would have had to have that conversation about, okay, what are we doing to stop that? Because nobody wants that, right? And I think that's the thing is all of us as professionals are always working at it, trying to figure out where those issues are and alert the product using public. Manufacturers are doing the same thing. Everybody's essentially singing from the same page of sheet music in how do we avoid those problems? And, like on this product, we did a 2-year field trial, but there's over a decade's worth of research on this stuff by the manufacturer beforehand. And as you know, having been involved in the sodium nitrite work for under EPA, EPA takes that stuff seriously. They go through it with a fine-tooth comb. It's not a slapdash kind of event. So even research being done by a product manufacturer, when it goes through that process, it is very much critically reviewed for any problems or any needs. And if EPA is not happy, they're going to ask you to go do more work and tell them things. And I think that's something, that folks in this country can feel good about. If you want that information, it's publicly available. You can ask EPA to see those studies, see those questions, and really get into the minutia of how everything works and why. And again, I digress on that one, but I think it's important to recognize that all of these products that come to market have quite a number of years of work behind them, and a lot of folks that are being very, very careful about environmental stewardship, human health and safety, food safety and security. And that's a lot of the driving conversation here. And one thing too, with managing pigs, I think it's always a tricky item for us because pigs are an animal that's on the landscape, reproduce quickly. We need to cut down on populations, but it's always, it seems, I don't want to say it's a losing battle because I don't believe in that, but it seems like we are always short of effective tools. And so sometimes folks say, well, hey, you're working on that. You're having some luck with it. I know it's not got federal approval yet or state approval, but that's ridiculous. We just need to get it out there. Sometimes we move a little slower so that when things do come out, we are much more confident that they're going to be safe in all the ways they could be.
Yeah. And so, at some level, there's inherent risk to non-target species, whether that's wildlife or domestic, with any of these toxicants that we're talking about, right? And that's variable spatially and temporally, how you use it, who's using it, all of those things add some level of variability into the efficacy of the product, right? And to that level of risk to those non-target species. But what are, if any, human health concerns around any of these toxicants?
Yeah, so that's a great question. With the sodium nitrite, I've not seen much in the way of human health concerns, and you would be better equipped to speak on that than I. With warfarin, it's an interesting one. There are good peer-reviewed papers out there over the years about warfarin residue levels in various animals that might have been exposed to it. There's good papers out there about and actually, most of this comes from European Union, like what level of residue of warfarin in meat would be required to cause a human health concern. That's interesting stuff. A lot of that's actually come out of Ireland, and it was years and years ago. With warfarin, because it metabolizes so quickly, most of it does not end up in muscle tissue. I'm sure there's some very small amount that does. In our work, we didn't evaluate this, so I'm going off of what I know in the veterinary literature and in other literature. But it metabolizes quickly. Most of it, if it's going to be in the body, it's going to be in a couple of internal organs, but not in muscle tissue. Being around the stuff, we always tell everybody, hey, put gloves on when you're handling and filling things up. But to be honest, with the warfarin, that has more to do with the fact with that blue dye, which is non-toxic, gets on everything. And it doesn't come out of stuff very easily, right? So that blue dye is a lot of the reason I say put gloves on. I think it's always a good idea to wear gloves. But with this stuff, contact issues for people, not very much. And that blue dye, I think, is an important element here. If a person were to get a pig that had died from this stuff, according to research that I've seen that's not my own, it's unlikely that there would be enough warfarin in an animal that had died from it to cause any harm. However, just because nobody wants to eat an animal that's been poisoned, and for good reason, The manufacturer includes a blue dye. This blue dye was actually developed for a different chemical years ago in an area where there were concerns about folks in impoverished communities that were desperate for food eating animals that had been killed by this toxin because they found them. Not pigs, not warfarin, different era, different chemicals. But the blue dye was created so that when you got this animal and you cut it open, it's bright blue. If you remember the old cartoon from the 80s, the Smurfs, it's Smurf blue. Kid you not. And humans kind of have this visceral reaction to you don't want to eat the blue thing, right? Something's not right about that. You may be into green eggs and ham, but something's not right about the blue pig. And I will tell you from experience with this thing, you see that blue is it's not appetizing, it's off-putting, but also is a warning signal. That dye shows up in fat tissue a few hours after the first time it's been ingested. And it would stay in a live pig for 21 days, I think. The pigs don't live that long. But if they were to get a sublethal dose of the stuff and you were to mess it up or something were to happen, that blue dye is still in their fat 21 days later, but the chemical was gone out of their body in 48 hours. So it's extra cautious, it's extra conservative. And with that blue dye, we knew it would dye fat blue. It's what it's designed to do. We also learned that it will dye some cartilage blue, and it will even dye synovial fluid in the joints blue. So long after that animal is dead and scavenged or whatever's happened on the landscape, you will see bones and joints dyed blue so that you have confidence, hey, this animal that died out here died from this toxicant. And again, we're talking about a dye, not the toxicant now. But
Sure.
one thing I would point out for our international audience that is dealing with the threat or the reality of African swine fever is if you find a dead pig somewhere, this triggers an investigation for good reason, and you may go into a mitigation mode because now you're concerned you've got an ASF fatality or lethality, and you've got to work with that. If the carcass is bright blue, perhaps this is something that is going to give you a little bit of confidence, even when it's been scavenged down to bones and hide. It still has that blue, and you say, okay, we still have processes we might be required to do because of the law, but this is ancillary evidence for us that maybe this was this that's been used, right? So for us in this part of the world, it's also to be able to say, hey, we think there's no risk to people eating this stuff, but this is the way of saying don't eat a blue pig. Don't eat a pig that's been exposed to the stuff. And as you know, in Texas, we've got a market where you can live sell swine and they enter the human food chain, but that's always USDA inspected, right? So our for those in the international audience, that's our US Department of Agriculture inspects all livestock as they go to slaughter before they enter the human food chain. That allows a USDA inspector, if there is one blue pig, to be able to say no. The same way that with feral swine, sometimes they present signs of various zoonotic diseases or just diseases of concern, and an inspector can say, not that one, right? So it's just more evidence, more material to work with for people that are trying to keep folks safe, even though the evidence that's out there in the literature suggests that residues from warfarin in that muscle tissue shouldn't be high enough to make a difference. Because I don't have my own data to speak from on that. That's all I can say.
Sure.
But there's essentially stop gaps and safety mechanisms in place to prevent that.
And I'll just touch real quick on human concerns of sodium nitrite, handling it or consuming it. Sodium nitrite is a food preservative. It is readily available and commonly used in meats as a preservative. I love the irony that it's heavily used in bacon. But the point is we consume it frequently. Some of us daily. And at low levels, there are no concerns. We can metabolize it, no problem. I'm reaching way back in my memory bank here. I do believe that pigs are 11 times more susceptible to sodium nitrite poisoning than humans are. So it would take, if somebody decided they were going to reach into a pig feeder and consume some of that bait, it would take You take a large amount, and then it metabolizes so fast. We did lab assays and tested how much residual sodium nitrite was in different organs of the pigs. And big picture, most everything came in below what's referred to as the bacon line, the amount of sodium nitrite that's in a piece of bacon, which is obviously safe for human consumption. So just real quick, one last series of questions, 2 questions in this is there a toxicant that will be the silver bullet? If we register a toxicant and it says, here we go, you can now use it, are they going to solve our pig problems?
No, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. And I hate to say it, but that's life, right? There's nothing in life that's perfect and magic.
And so, as you mentioned at the top of this, we've got to continue to look at integrated pest management strategies and incorporating everything that we have available to us. I'm sure this is going to vary regionally and case by case, but are there any best management practices on how to incorporate toxicants into, let's say, an eradication campaign?
Right. So it's a good question. And this comes down to the matter of what fits for your operation. So there are some places that, for a variety of reasons, shooting, trapping, anything else might not be on the table, but maybe this one would. We had one landowner that said, I don't like the idea of shooting animals, but I'm okay with this. So I want to use this. Oh, okay, fine, right? That fits their personal ethical stance. Another place that it can be very useful is in areas where you have very few pigs left. If you're towards the end of an eradication effort, this is an area we often talk about because in this kind of a context, it is a device that if you had very few pigs left, probably wouldn't need to refill it all that often, right? Because you can hold a couple 100 pounds of bait easily. And it's one that could be effective in getting the last few pigs out of an area more economically than you might be able to with other labor or more intensive methods. That might be a good place for it. There are certain municipalities that have expressed an interest in using it just because in their municipalities they don't want firearms used. Now they have to deal with the issue of what are you going to do about carcasses? But that's a municipal question. They may have properties that works on. Everybody gets to choose for themselves. But I think where toxicants fit in, you can integrate them into management similarly to what you do with traps, which I alluded to earlier in terms of it's a bait station. It has to be maintained similarly to baiting a trap. Don't shoot around it, shoot elsewhere, drive the pigs to it. It can function very much in that vein if a person wanted to. But in these other more specialty contexts where we have just a few pigs left and we haven't been able to get them patterned, they won't come to an area where we can shoot them, or we can't get them interested in this particular bait, but maybe this stuff would work. That might be an area. One thing I would point out about this bait, which I find fascinating, and I've said this to the manufacturer, so I'll say it on here. When we first used it, we were using the placebo version of it just to get pigs used to the stuff. They love it. They would happily eat this stuff over corn. So I said, you know, what illicit substance is in this bait that gets them so excited to use it, right? And he's like, nothing.
And we're talking about the warfarin.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that bait matrix, we did talk about, you know, what all was mixed into it. It's a variety of attractants, right? The only context that we couldn't get pigs to really express a concerted interest in using it was in a time of year when acorns were abundant. And as you know, John, we've had some dry years in Texas the last couple of years. And in dry times, oak trees will produce an overabundance of acorns as a hedge against dying in the drought. For those that don't know, wild boar in the old world, their chief diet item of preference is acorns, which is why you get things like jamón ibérico out of Spain, which is fed exclusively acorns, and it's a cured meat product. And it's very good. So it's hard to get pigs to eat anything other than acorns when they're highly abundant, as well as when we had peanuts that were ready to harvest. It was hard to get the pigs to eat anything but those peanuts. But if I were trapping in that time, or I were trying to train them to a shooting site, it would be difficult to get them on anything because they're keyed into those natural food or agricultural food items. Other than that, was great. They love the stuff. But this is the point I make. No tool is perfect all the time, everywhere. In those times, what would I have done? I probably would have gone to some shooting method where I could go where the pigs were and shoot the pigs on the food resources that they were using because I couldn't get them trained. Wouldn't matter if I was trapping or using a toxicant or what have you. And so I think that's the thing is be creative with how you integrate this. If you see an opportunity and you think this is the product for you, and there's an opportunity to integrate a chemical method, do it. If it opens up new time or new area to control pigs, you're doing the right thing.
Perfect. We got right at 10 minutes to field any questions that may come in, and looks like the Q&A box is pretty light. So let's not let Dr. Tomeček off the hook quite that easily. Let's get some questions rolling in.
I'm going through a tunnel.
Tony, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So it looks like the question that we have in the chat is, what is the cost for warfarin per dead pig versus other methods like trapping?
Yeah, so that's a great question that everybody wants to know the answer to. And unfortunately, we don't really have cost effectiveness data to present on ours. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, we were working with the product before it was available to the public. So our pricing is different from commercial pricing now, I'm sure. But also, we were experimental in our use, right? So there's a lot of variability in how folks used it. Some was more efficient with products, some was less efficient. And so I really can't say like, this is what it costs with warfarin per pig to kill them. In the same way, I can't say that with trapping because yes, different traps will be a little bit different, but a lot of it has to do with the individual trapper, with that sounder of pigs and how much they've been messed with and how hard they are to train if we were trapping or to this toxicant. And we definitely saw that pigs that were more frequently harassed, it was harder to get them comfortable coming to this. So it took more time and more product. So I really can't say what the cost per pig is going to be, but I know if you're interested, the manufacturer can run you through a pricing sheet and can talk to you about, their recommended amounts of product to purchase, et cetera, with your pig problem.
Awesome. And then another question just came through. They said, where can I find more info on the products and where can I purchase it?
So good question. On the warfarin-based product, if you want to see the results from our field trial and learn more about it, the manufacturer of the product, which is Symetrics Limited, actually has that up on their website. So they even linked over to our report, as well as they've got their own internal, the documentation, labels, restrictions, all that stuff. And again, in the US, it's only registered in Texas right now, but you can still see that federal registration and what it requires. And as far as where to buy it, they may have a list of distributors in Texas up on their website, but I know if you contact them, they've got that list because I know it's been growing recently as more folks have expressed an interest. So I recommend just reaching out and getting that distributor list from them.
Awesome. And then would you be able to purchase the feeders also from that same company, or where are those produced from a different manufacturer?
Great question, actually. So the feeders are prescribed on the registration, which is something I neglected to mention earlier, and it's good to point out. So, John and I talked about how important it is to exclude non-targets and how the feeders have been designed to do that, and they work quite well. And the feeders are required on the label. You have to buy them with the product. They dispense them together. And I will say that I think that is a good thing because it ensures that you're getting what you need. They are made by a third party, but sold through the distributors with the product.
Awesome. And then last one I see here is where online is there more information about the process / methodology of applying warfarin?
So if you wanted to go online and see more about the process, I know the manufacturers got their own stewardship training that they've put together. And as well, you could see with our study report kind of how we did it. What did we do? How did we go through the process? And what were our recommendations? But essentially what it comes down to, and you'll find this on their website as well, is that there is a pre-baiting phase where you put the feeder out, open it up, fill it with corn, get them used to, or some other grain or substance they're used to eating already, right? We use corn because every pig in Texas knows corn. So get them started on corn. Then we started to mix in the placebo version of the product, right? Non-toxic placebo, and get them used to that. And then one thing that we did and it's incorporated into the newer models of that feeder, is we had it open all the way, and then we had a half stop, if you will, another position where they could see the bait, but they could not get to it without sticking their head in and opening the door, which sped up that process of them learning how to use it. Once they knew how to use the feeder, close the door, remove all the non-toxic, and you fill it up with toxic product. And then you bait till they're all gone. And you check that feeder every 2 to 4 days, depending on how quickly it's being depleted, more often in the beginning, and then you can slow down. And that's all on the label as well, right? All of this is on there. But that pre-baiting phase is critically important, where you got to get them comfortable with the stuff. Pigs that have been harassed less, they definitely get accustomed to the feeder much faster. We had some that in a few days they were using it, no big deal. We had others that took a couple of weeks because they were nervous about it, didn't really figure it out. And that's that pig to pig variability. So you can find that stuff on their website as well as in the report that we did from our work.
And looks like we're getting pretty close to time, so we'll just take one more question.
Sure.
And this one seems pretty interesting. It says, can the warfarin product be passed from sow to nursing piglets?
So that's a great one that I've been asked a lot of times, which I think is fascinating, and we don't know. So I asked this question of the manufacturer, and I asked this question of a couple of biochemists, and a little bit of background that's important. So the manufacturer makes a lot of chemical control products. They have their own research staff at their facility, and they do a lot of these things. So like when it comes to, what are toxic levels and various things, they're doing all that in-house. This was a good question that theoretically we don't expect. We don't see that. I didn't see any evidence for that in the field. From a biochemical level, we don't really expect that to happen, and not in any meaningful way, right? Not in any amount that would make a difference. But it's a good question. I mentioned earlier that we saw very small piglets actively using the product. And I found that fascinating because, yeah, little ones, mom would hold the door open and they would eat under mom. Or in some cases, when they get just a little bit bigger, but they're still small, they're cooperatively opening those doors so they can feed.
All right, we're up against it, so we're gonna go ahead and let Dr. Tomeček go. I did see one question come in that I'm just gonna hit real quick.
Sure.
Just to reemphasize to everybody that in the States, there is only one product with an EPA label, and that is the warfarin product.
Mhm.
And the last time that Dr. Tomeček and I checked, there was only one state in the United States that had registered that product for use in that state, and that is Texas. So keep an eye on that. Probably your state agriculture agency is going to be releasing that if they do decide to label it in your individual state. So yes, please pay attention to where these things are legal and are not legal before you start administering them on your lands. That's going to do it. And really appreciate you spending time with us, Dr. Tomeček, and everybody that tuned in. We will have this recording available and sent to everybody via email sometime next week, most likely. So, and if there are any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, log on to the Brig website and shoot us some questions, and we'll be sure to answer anything that you might have.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone.